Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking an absolutely fascinating paradox, one that sits right at the very heart of modern religious institutions. Have you ever actually stopped to wonder how major, ancient organizations handle new, and let's be honest, sometimes really uncomfortable historical facts? Well, that's exactly what we're going to explore today. We're keeping things completely objective, and we're looking at this through the lens of a concept known as the two-track system. It's a system that creates a massive information gap in modern religion.
So, the big question, are these pious lies taught publicly, or do churches actively cover them up? This hits at one of the most painful, most complex paradoxes we see in faith communities today. Think about it. When modern archaeology or historical analysis flat out contradicts a traditional biblical narrative, what does the institution actually do? Well, the short answer is both, and neither. It entirely depends on where you're looking. Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to break down the distinct institutional approaches to this paradox, along a spectrum of transparency. We'll start with the paradox of pious lies itself. Then, we'll look at the academic sphere with its total openness, move on to the tactical silence of traditional churches, and then the active denial from fundamentalists. Finally, we'll wrap up by looking at the growing gap between the altar and the university.
Section 1. The Paradox of Pious Lies.
You see, when you look at modern religion, there isn't just one single unified approach to history. Instead, we see this two-track system. On one track, you've got the highly educated religious elites. We're talking theologians, scholars, seminary professors. And then on the other track, you have everyday people just sitting in the pews on a Sunday morning. And here's the kicker. The information flowing along these two tracks is often wildly different. It creates a huge systemic information gap. Section 2. The Academic Sphere, Total Openness.
If you enroll in a university to study theology, you are going to walk into an environment of total, absolute openness. No secrets. Future priests and pastors are taught to read biblical texts using what's called the historical critical method. This means scholars openly accept some pretty surprising facts as standard historical reality. For example, the Gospel of Mark? It was written first. Matthew and Luke literally just copied and edited Mark's work. Those pastoral epistles like Timothy, they weren't actually written by the Apostle Paul. And the book of Revelation is analyzed as a political pamphlet aimed at its specific era, not some futuristic prophecy. The academic sphere has completely neutrally accepted these concepts since the mid-20th century, usually just framing them as literary genres or theological redactions.
Section 3. Traditional Churches. Tactical Silence.
So what happens when a highly educated priest actually graduates, leaves that rigorous, open academic setting, and steps up to the Sunday pulpit? Well, you get a jarring contrast between what the priest learned in seminary and what that exact same priest chooses to preach to everyday believers, families, and grandmothers. Suddenly, those harsh historical facts are quietly swapped out for spiritual meaning and pastoral comfort. I mean, a scholar knows that the story of the Three Kings, or the slaughter of the innocents, are almost certainly just literary devices used by the author of Matthew. But can you imagine a priest standing up on Christmas morning and saying, "Hey everyone, Matthew completely made up the story. No way, they just don't do it." And it's super important to understand that this usually isn't some malicious twirling mustache conspiracy. It's actually born out of pastoral care, and frankly, fear. They employ a sort of tactical silence to protect their flock. They're terrified that raw historical reality might unnecessarily destroy a simple, comforting faith. So they prioritize the theological myth over the historical timeline.
Section 4. Fundamentalists. Active Denial of Facts.
Now, while traditional churches choose silence, there's a globally growing movement of conservative evangelicals and fundamentalists that takes a completely different route. The absolute core of their worldview is this doctrine of inerrancy. This is the rigid, dogmatic requirement that the Bible is 100% infallible. Literally, they believe the text was dictated by the Holy Spirit, making it historically and scientifically accurate from page 1 to the end. Because of this uncompromising stance, pastors in these circles can't just politely stay silent. No, they have to actively push back against modern science, history, and archaeology. Let's take a standard academic consensus as an example. Fact. Moses most likely did not exist as a singular historical figure. Now, in the academic sphere, this is just discussed openly, no big deal, but picture this. What happens when an independent, curious learner in a fundamentalist church reads an archaeology book, discovers this fact, and brings it up to their pastor? How does the institution react to that?
The reaction? It's often incredibly intense and combative. Instead of saying, yeah, there's a historical debate there, the dissenter gets hit with labels. They might be called a person of weak faith, under the influence of Satan and secular liberalism. The institution leans hard into complex apologetics to try and smooth over any logical contradictions. They will aggressively defend the literal text at absolutely all costs, usually by attacking the credibility of whoever dared to ask the question.
So the crucial takeaway here is how these three distinct levels manage the exact same information in totally different ways. The academic level uses the historical critical method, which results in total openness. The traditional church level leans heavily on spiritual meaning, resulting in that tactical silence. And the fundamentalist level relies on apologetics, leading to active denial. It is literally the exact same ancient text, just processed through three completely different institutional filters.
Section 5. The gap between altar and university. Because listen, when you maintain a two-track system for long enough, the friction between those tracks is eventually going to spark a fire, and it results in a really common, often pretty tragic journey for a modern believer. It usually goes like this. Step 1. An individual takes their faith seriously and starts doing some independent study using secular or academic sources, which inevitably leads to Step 2, the sudden, jarring discovery of these hidden historical facts, facts that everyone in academia already knows, but literally no one ever mentioned in church. Step 3 is a severe psychological shock. It's a massive crisis of trust. And that culminates in Step 4, a profound feeling of betrayal that ultimately leads them to just pack up and walk away from the religious institution entirely. Which leaves us with this final, absolutely vital question. When the gap between academia and the altar grows too wide, what happens to faith? This psychological shock, that gut-wrenching feeling that the truth was actively withheld just for the sake of comfort, it's one of the primary reasons intellectually curious people are leaving religious institutions today. It forces us all to sit back and really ponder, what is the ultimate long-term cost of pious lies? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those tough questions, and I'll see you next time.